All right. Hello. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian asked for me to explore an ancient text, ancient maybe, called the Oera Linda. And after talking with him a little back and forth, I mentioned I knew a guy who was very good at reading ancient texts. And so we have a special guest to join me in our exploration of the Oera Linda. Clinton, would you mind telling the audience? I've chatted with you before. Anyone who follows the caffeine stream, no doubt listened to our conversation there. But would you mind reintroducing yourself for the you? I think you know a little bit more about Thor in particular than the average person.
Yeah, my name is Clinton J. McMillan. I run the Thor Cedar page on Instagram. I also have a website, thorcedar.org, and I am also active on Telegram, where I basically divulge Thor cult information. That's a very broad term, but where I investigate the Thor cult, basically analyze Old Norse and Old Norse poetry.
Yeah, in the same way that I am an amateur philosopher in the old sense of the word amateur, Clinton is an amateur linguist, and it's very important for the audience to not get caught up on the word amateur
I got
here
no
in terms
letters
of
on my name.
yeah.
No
Oh,
letters on my name.
me neither, right? Um, but you know your shit,
Yeah,
proverbially speaking. Like
I would say.
you've done a fair bit of academic reading, and you have developed um not just an extraordinary bullshit detector in this domain, but have actually found some interesting things, which is what we were talking about when I interviewed you on the caffeine stream about Thor and Odin and how Odin became the head god, which may not have actually been how things were back in the day, um, which is not mainstream opinion about that.
Mhm.
So like you've got some what would you call it? Not credentials, but some background in this domain.
Mhm.
So, without further ado, an introduction, let's get into the topic at hand, the Oera Linda. Now, the Oera Linda is a text that appeared sometime in the 1850s, 1840s, somewhere in the 19th
I
century.
believe the early 1800s, yes.
Yeah, 1840s, 1850s, somewhere in there. And it seems to purports itself to be an ancient Frisian text that has been copy pasted forward into the present, holding on to old traditions about who the Frisians were, their backgrounds, their values. Um, that was sort of what I got out of it. Um, that and after listening to Robert Sepehr's introduction to it, knowing literally nothing about the Oerlinda or the or Robert Sepehr, it struck me immediately as fraudulent. And I didn't have the right word for why until I listened to one of the most extraordinary debates I've heard recently, which was the debate between Wes Huff and Billy Carson, which I recommend anyone who's interested in ancient texts and in analyzing ancient texts, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're religious or not, you should go listen to that debate because it is such a it's one of the most illustrative. It's like watching Shu Xiaodong beat up an old fake martial arts teacher. You know, it's like what happens when a cult leader who thinks he's a historian runs into an actual historian. And the juxtaposition could not be more clear. And the word that Wes Huff used in distinguishing old texts from new texts was this word verisimilitude, which is, does this text have the appearance, the correct appearance of truth for its context and time? And that's what struck me when I was listening to passages that were being read of the Ora Linda. I'm like, this reads like someone is pushing the values and worldview of the 19th century into the 5th century or whenever. But I'm curious what your take is on Robert Sepehr and the Oera Linda, because you've got a lot more background in this than I do.
So Robert Sepehr, I've seen a handful of his videos. I do know some people who have, been avid followers of his work. Um, a lot of it is some of those mystical fantasies of, the nationalist vein.
Mm,
I've seen those in terms of like Atlantis and other things like that. Those are generally, when we look at people who kind of propagate those narratives, we have to take them with a grain of salt. Now, when we're looking at ancient
like Billy
history,
Carson.
yeah, when we're looking at ancient history, what we have to do is we have to see whether or not it corresponds to historical attestations
Mm,
of the culture. So that's incredibly important, and that's legal, religious, or otherwise. In the vein of the Aura Linda book, that one's always hard to pronounce. Um, we have to look at the language. The language is incredibly important, and that's something I harp on very frequently in my studies because we have to authenticate it.
mm,
Authenticating language is important because we have to look at the grammar, the syntax, and how things are spoken corresponding to what we have of the time frame. I believe the Aura Linda book claims to have been written in 1286.
okay.
Um, Now, when we're looking at that, we have to look at a number of things. Are the words being spoken in this text the same as that time frame? That's
Yes.
incredibly
And
important.
they are in this case, I want to say right now they appear to be not. So big asterisk here. No one should use AI programs as definitive. When I use AI for work,
Yes.
I tell me where do I look this up, not what does it say, because it will lie to you. But for
Hmm.
the purpose of quick, and anyone can go and check this myself, I asked ChatGPT like what the consensus was, and it said, well, it's a fraudulent document basically. And I said, well, are there specific examples? And it listed five examples. It says there are modern Dutch and modern Frisian influences in the language, and it gives specific examples. It says, for example, the word tijd, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, Tijd, appears in the text, which is a modern Dutch word. In Old Frisian, one would expect tid, Ti with a line D. And it also says the phrase ik ben, I am, which follows the modern Dutch and Frisian patterns, whereas Old Frisian would use something like ik bem or ik bin. So
Hmm.
little things like that, little modern idiosyncrasies are tells. And you know, you a trained this is the difference between an amateur and a trained linguist. A trained linguist can actually give you the like this is the form, and what makes the study of linguistics so cool is that there are laws and rules to how languages evolve over time. Like they always move in the same kinds of ways, always with an asterisk, of course. Um, but as an amateur, you can still read this and be like, this feels incorrect. If you've this feels like the wrong era.
Yes, that's actually very important because when we look at language, we can get the sense of how old it is by the way it's spoken. We also have to take into consideration localized dialects. So, for instance, there is Greenlandic Norse, which not a lot
Hmm.
of people think really know about.
Yeah,
It is a variation of Old Norse, but it has certain phonetic structures. It's actually interestingly conservative in some elements, but it also has elements of Middle Norwegian. And so, unless you're reading
mm,
it and you know that, and there's actually only one excerpt in a legal text of a marriage, and then there's also runic evidence. So you have to look at the
interesting.
idiosyncrasies of a dialect and a locality when you're looking at that. And for instance, where was this discovered? Where was this book supposedly discovered? Does it actually hold that dialect and does it ring true throughout
Right,
the entire text?
right. And I mean, I don't. There are certain documents that are not fraudulent,
Mhm.
but which show signs of combining different dialects from different places. And so when you see a dialect from this part of Turkey combined with a dialect from this part of Greece in like one single poem, like the Iliad, you're like, okay, this was aggregated from a number of different sources into a single document. It didn't come from a single place. So if someone claimed, oh, this came from a single source, you could say fairly definitively from the linguistic evidence, no, no, it did not.
Most texts, and for instance, like let's take the Eddas. Um, there's many different variations of like the Younger Edda. And the reason why they call it the Younger Edda is actually because it was the variations, the four particular manuscripts are written later in time. Now, it was purportedly written in, I believe, 1240, 1270, but the Elder Edda of the Norse is written in 1270. So it's roughly the same. So
Hmm.
you can look at it that way, the history of a manuscript and how many people wrote it down. Okay. And you can tell from the scripts. And this goes into a lesser known field of analyzing, letters and how things are written,
Hmm.
looking at the material as well. So, for instance, okay, is the Era Linda book, is it written in the same style and script of the 12th century or the 13th century, rather? We
Right.
can look at the actual book and compare it to, like, let's say, legal documentation of the time.
So this is the funniest one, because when it was originally brought forth, within 20 years, apparently the experts of the time refused to even look at it because they thought it would be undignified to even like to even look at it. But eventually someone said, "Okay, fine, we'll take a look at this." And they sent it to a local book publisher and said, "Hey, can you tell us about when these pages were made?"
Mm.
And they said, "Yeah, sure, we can look at it." And they looked at the watermarks, they looked at how the paper was cut, they looked at the material of the paper, and they said, "This paper is about 25 years old."
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
now that doesn't mean that the text, which the opening of the Oera Linda is like, copy this down and hold on to it. Like you can copy something old down onto something new, and it doesn't mean like a copy is not necessarily fraudulent. But if a document is purported to be from the 13th century or the 12th century, and the material is from the 19th century, that is a problem.
It has a huge gap. And
Mhm.
I also would say if there's explicit instructions, that you can tell like there's a narrative around it.
Mm.
And in this book in particular, there is a narrative around it. During that time frame, there was a lot of nationalistic movements. There was a lot of epics being written. So you have to look at the time and place and the characters who are either finding it or are associated with the manuscript. That's incredibly important because then you can kind of see, okay, what narratives are being pushed within it.
Mhm.
Um, I find it's very useful to look at it through that lens. And, for instance, many of the Epic poems are very old. The reason we know that is because we can isolate certain older phonology within it, and there's certain terms that are not being used in the modern sense.
Right.
And so that, I mean, for instance, Thrinskvida, the story about Thor, cross-dressing. That one is some of the oldest verbiage in all of Old Norse. It dates back to
Mm.
like 800s or 900s that we can, project. But you also have to be wary of whether or not a text has a timeline or a chronology of the classical or biblical era. That's incredibly important too, because oftentimes what people want to do is they want to correspond their history to the biblical narrative. That way, in a
Mhm.
way, it justifies what they're writing,
Right.
um, and that they're involved in sacred history. You see this with both of the ancient Irish texts, who equate their descent from Egypt, and then in the prologue of Snorri's Edda. It's very crucial to look at narratives when we're
Mhm.
investigating these things.
Yes, absolutely. And that brings me to, I want to segue a little bit because you are not just a linguist, but also a spiritual leader in the local sort of Pacific Northwest area. And Oh, are you still there?
Cutting out a
You
little
still
bit.
there? Okay. Um, I can't see you moving, but I can hear you, so I'll keep going. You're a spiritual leader of sorts as well. Um, so there was a another video on the Oera Linda by a YouTuber named Asha Logos who claims, even if this text is revealed to be totally false, totally fraudulent, it is still valuable for its mythic for its lessons in the way that fiction is. And that's an interesting separate question, and it's a tricky one because he opens with this to sort of get past the guard, and then over the course of his hour-long video works his way back around to basically saying a bunch of Scythian this stuff and that stuff. It is historical, so an interesting sort of end run rhetorically. But do you think there can be sort of spiritual value in texts of this sort?
Personally, I would say no. The reason why I say that is because there's a manufactured spirituality behind it. Um,
Hmm.
when we look at these things, a lot of the narratives are personal spiritualisms. Okay. And that is not going to correspond to a culture, that is going to correspond to one person.
So if you think
And
you're trying to connect with your ancestors, you're actually missing the target and you're connecting with one guy's hopes and dreams.
yeah, basically one guy's wet dream. And that's, I don't think that it's spiritually valid because when people are looking for a spiritual outlet, and for instance, with paganism connecting to ancient ethnic folkways, they want to connect to a greater whole. They want to connect to their ancestry and things like that and participate in sacred custom. In this book in particular, there's kind of a corresponding Freya cult within it where it mirrors almost the Vestal Virgins of Rome,
It states
which
that
is
explicitly. Yeah.
exactly. And so I find that highly suspect because it's trying to connect with an ancient past somewhere else, and we can't really quantify it. I think it's incredibly important to look at what the attestations are, what the cultural
Mhm.
specificities are, and also, again, to the region. That's very important. I don't find any value in them personally
Yeah.
because when you're connecting with one guy's current, if we're talking about esoteric terms, in esoterica today and in the past, they talk about these streams of currents like cults today. You're basically just tapping into one guy's. You're not tapping into the ancient Frisian cult. You're tapping into what this guy wants it to be.
Right.
And I would say that it's look at, like, let's say the occultism of the NSDAP, like Carl Maria Villagut. That is a very esoteric topic. You have to look at some of these things, like he said, as he wanted to connect to a 12,000-year-old solar dynasty that he himself is the only relation to. That doesn't fucking track.
Very convenient.
Very convenient that you are the sole holder of all of this esoteric wisdom and that you are connected to this God, and you have only his lessons. And
Right.
anytime you hear something like that, grain of salt.
Yeah. And for me, the other thing to keep an eye out for is internal contradictions of value. I think a lot of internal contradictions of material details can be overlooked as non-important, because when you aggregate lots of different texts, things get mistranslated or whatever, and that's fine. But if there's like deep internal contradictions of value, that should be a red flag um about the authenticity. And the one that comes to mind is with the Ora Linda in particular is there is a claim made that the old Frisian language was constructed by the gods in such a way that no man could lie or speak deceptively in this tongue without stammering or
Mhm.
giving himself away. And it variously describes like the importance of honesty and
Mhm.
freedom and stuff, and like not being deceptive, not being tricky. And like this text is a fraudulent text. So if you are, you know, Asha Logos and saying, well, even if it's fraudulent, I think there's some value to be gained from the text because it's like the message it's giving is very valuable, like a parable. It's like, well, if one of the parabolic messages is the importance of honesty and directness, and the medium is directly contradictory to that, the, the spiritual value you might gain from that, I think, is compromised.
It negates its value
Hmm.
ultimately because looking at internal values of a culture is really important, and how it's portrayed. You look at a lot of I would say older poems, like Germanic poems, like very straightforward,
Hmm.
very straightforward. There's not a lot of abstract concept within them, and that relates directly to the people. There was not a lot. I mean, for instance, I think Jackson Crawford actually said in one video that they don't actually talk about what bravery is, what constitutes bravery. They just say, "Oh, this was a brave man for his deeds. He was a strong man." What
That's the
constitutes
opening
strength?
of that's the opening of Beowulf, is it not? He says it just describes a few things, and then it says this of one man. It's like that was one good king, and then it moves on to the next thing. It's
Exactly. And I find that a lot of these texts too, they over explain themselves. That's also a
mm,
huge indicator.
okay, that's a really good tell. Yeah,
Yeah.
over
So,
explanation.
and you can see that someone who is trying to deceive usually over explains.
Hmm.
And especially in text, like we look at Germanic texts, they're very vague. They're very vague. The
Because it was
Old Norse,
assumed that the audience of the time already had a lot of implicit knowledge that was necessary to understand what was being said, which we don't have now necessarily.
exactly, and they didn't explain many things. That's why there's an interwoven literalism and symbolism. That's incredibly important because the people who are, for instance, listening to these poems or these songs, they understand the language, they understand the mythology, they understand the peculiarities of it, and they don't need any explanation.
Hmm.
They just they're listening and they're understanding it already. Whereas we as the audience, we are bereft of that. We do not understand today what they're actually talking about. And so oftentimes we retroject the modern view on things, and that
Hmm.
skews our understanding of history.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, speaking of vagueness, I think one of the attractions of a lot of these types of texts is the attraction of the esoteric and the hidden, right? We
Mhm.
have this kind of attraction to this thing. And it's ironic that people get pulled into fraudulent texts when there's so much interesting stuff going on in the real texts that we have. So much to unpack that is difficult to unpack, and that it takes some initiation into these ancient cultures and their language and their way of viewing the world that has to happen in order to grasp it. For example, if you stick a regular person with no training in front of a Heraclitus, fragment, for example, they might have a difficult time. But like a very and you've got more background with Heraclitus than most people. Um, so like, on the subject, because I don't want to leave our patron here just like, well, this is crappy. Are there particular alternative sort of esoteric texts that we might turn to that are informative about Germanic and Frisian culture from that like 12th, 13th century era, that you would point people who are interested in that towards instead of um, the sorts of fraudulent esoteric occult texts.
So when we say esoteric, we want to be very careful about that term.
Of course, yes.
Esoteric, one of the poles to the esoteric is gatekeeping,
Mm,
gatekeeping of information and spiritual knowledge. We want to avoid that. And oftentimes the people get on a power trip with that. But in terms of the Frisian
that's true.
cult, or cults rather, um, a lot of it's legal codes and historical tractates about that.
Oh, that's very fitting.
It's yeah, there's not much. It's very similar with the Anglo-Saxons.
Mm,
The Anglo-Saxons don't have a lot of heathen knowledge retained. They have many of the, I would say, Christian or pseudo-Christian folk ways retained. And you can see that throughout their poems, their attestations of that, some of their artwork, and as such. There is one story, actually, a settlement story of the Frisians, and it actually has to do with either Forseti or Fossite. It has to do with an island there. And this is actually why I call bullshit on the Eralinda book, because it doesn't correspond to this historical narrative of settlement.
mm.
There was apparently a man who, on one of the settlement boats to Frisia or Friesland, um, he essentially took a golden axe and threw it to the shore. And where it stemmed, I believe, was a water fountain or a well that came up. And what he did is he spent time with the people there, and he developed the law speakers, the asegas, and taught them the laws, the culture, everything like that. That is one story that does ring true, and I do think that people should look into that because there is a sort of ethnogenesis story there, a true ethnogenesis story,
Interesting.
because it's recounted within the historical time frame. But when we're looking at things like this, we really want to compare and contrast, like what is recorded about the history, the
Yeah.
culture there,
That
even
that
folk tales.
that attestation correspondence test seems like a really good starting point for anyone who wants to begin looking into these things. I
It's
really
crucial.
like the over explanation tell as well.
Mhm.
That seems like almost uniform across most pseudo ancient texts. Um,
Yes. Yeah, they basically tried to describe where they're from, how they obtained this, and why they're connected to this. Even Snorri does it. He euhemerizes the gods and basically connects them to Troy, and then or therein by Rome for some reason. But it basically officiates what they're writing. Okay, and it
so
basically
it
justifies
becomes
it all.
part of a what's the word? A political formula, to borrow
Yes.
from the Italian school of political theory. Here's the rationalization for why our leaders should be leaders. They're
Yes.
divine right. They're descended of Odin, don't you know? But this is why the Germanic people are better, is because this is this history that connects them to the gods and so forth. And that seems to be
Yeah.
more or less universal. I mean, every culture seems to have some variation of a we're the people, and our name means the people in like many cases. But for the historian who's looking to connect with what a people was actually like, so they can understand the people and they can understand themselves, um, it's important to be able to maybe differentiate from the political myths from the actual folk customs that characterize the people themselves.
Yeah, there was actually one Dutch and thereby I would presume Frisian folktale. It's called the Volutionsagen. That's actually a really cool one. It's
Hmm.
a compilation. I forget the author. I may pull it up later, but it's a compilation of folk tales, and it actually has a really cool one about like the god Thor and his battle with the winter giants and the serpent, and it actually recounts his death within that saga tradition, and it also corresponds to a lot of the localized, um, you know, land formations of lakes, of mountains, things of that sort.
Nice. Interesting.
Uh, I think that things like that you have to look at in terms of where does a book come from, and
Hmm.
where does a story come from, and oftentimes when we look at pseudo political mythic fantasies, what they're trying to do is basically legitimize their current position, their current standing.
Hmm.
And you see that often with like uh, Harold Fairhair in the Norse. There's been like three or four different genealogies connecting him to like Freyr, Njorth, Odin,
Hmm.
Thor. to legitimize his rule as the divine right of kings.
Right.
And so, I do think that that's universal.
And it is worth mentioning too, maybe to flag this distinction. There is a massive difference as a 21st century reader between reading a 12th century political myth about a 12th century guy and a 19th century political myth about a 12th century guy.
Yes.
Like those are completely different categories of story, and maybe they're both wrong. Maybe they're both pure propaganda in their own ways. But at least the 12th century myth that justifies the legitimacy of the king in the 12th century or whatever is like telling us something about what was going on in that time. And so if we're trying to learn about that time, reading the propaganda about that time is one way to go about doing it. Reading the propaganda from the 19th and maybe 20th century about the 12th century is not so much telling us about the 12th century, it's more telling us about the 19th and 20th century.
Well, they're completely different worldviews.
Right.
The manner in which people think is drastically different from the 12th century to the 19th century and even to today. A lot
Yes.
of the things that people believe, we look at today and be like, that's fucking nonsense. That makes no sense. Why are we doing
Right.
that? But in the time and space of that custom or that tale, it made sense. I think that there was also spiritual truth to it because at some point, either someone was, I would say, revealed in some manner, or there was a collective experience or a collective myth. Okay, and these shape a people. Now we can look at these things and kind of tell aspects of a culture. Okay,
Mhm.
it also determines again what that current of that culture is like. Okay, um, that's the same kind of tell we have with the 19th century writers, and even to
Yeah.
today. There's a
Well,
lot of people who write today that do that.
and I think that's what's fascinating about reading good quality propaganda. I mean, the stuff that really persuades people
Mhm.
is like that good propaganda works because it taps into some mythic or value based beliefs or values that people have in the
Mhm.
moment. And so if you look at the propaganda that works in the 12th century, it's like this really persuaded people. You get a sense, you get a sort of um, a foot in the water of the spirit that they held. Um, and it can be a path to understanding and connection there, even if it's like tainted to some degree by
Mhm.
ideological motives. Um, and maybe that's the great danger of books like the Oera Linda is to the degree that it persuades people it's really like historical, it gives the illusion of that connection, but you're connecting with something else entirely. Um,
People want to tap into a mythic reality or a cultic reality.
mhm.
And these are very interesting modes of thought because when you do that, you're interacting with a worldview.
Right.
People want things to describe the world to them. They want to interact with things in a way that makes their life have more meaning. And so when they tap into these things, they develop meaning, especially when you're bereft of internal meaning, you latch on to outside meaning.
Hmm.
So at that point, you're easily manipulated anyway. But I would caution against also looking at even ancient texts, under the vein of we would today of like, let's say, okay, there's probably some propaganda or manipulation because their propaganda was likely, again, interwoven with their symbolism and their ethnogenesis and their myth.
Right.
They wouldn't even really know the difference.
It makes a lot of sense. In some places, it's really ham-fisted and obvious. Like
Yeah.
many of the Roman mythic stories are kind of like little on the nose. Um, I like to think the Greek ones are a little bit more subtle, but the Greeks also disagreed with each other on a lot of things, so you get some very interesting tensions there.
Yeah.
Um, and I imagine that's true in most cultures to varying degrees as well.
It's true with all of humanity, man.
Yeah.
It's just the
So
the state of being.
so fantastic. Well, I'll if you send me the links to like a couple of those sagas, I will post those in the description here because I think it's always great to move people towards like better stuff.
Yeah.
Whenever someone mentions like esoteric text, my brain immediately jumps to Plato's Republic. uh, and the sort of esoteric reading is like it's a legit text. It's just there's different ways you can read it, and it's ambiguous in a very wry, like winky kind of way. But that's not usually the sense of esoteric that people mean when they like want to put on robes and meet at night in a dark place and
Yeah, I think
with
of
their
completely different
scroll.
subjects with esoteric.
Yeah.
I think of Kenneth Grant and all that type of stuff, witchcraft and all that kind of subject. But I think
Mhm.
that what people just want a mythic reality or cultic reality to live in. And I think that when we look at that, that's
Mhm.
what people want when they say esoteric.
Yeah. Well, and again, to redirect people in maybe a more positive direction, one of the great world creators of the 20th century did so on the back of legit old texts like Beowulf and the other
Mhm.
sagas and ancient law texts and regular rune poems, like nothing to write home about, like A and C. I'm talking, of course, about J.R. Tolkien and
Mhm.
his Lord of the Rings, which is based explicitly, drawing directly from many of these sagas. Um, and he created a world out of that and created new languages and created meaning and created orientation for many people. Um, that's, I think, much more powerful magic than anything done with a hood and wand with other, you know, obscure wannabe cultists somewhere.
He even scoffed at his own work at times, his hobby, he would call it. Because he developed a second world. Um,
Hmm.
and that's what a lot of people want in sometimes when they think of religion or esoterica and stuff like that. You see a lot of modern esotericists, they develop their own world. It's their
Yeah.
own internal monologue and it defines everything they do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But I like to imagine, and I of course can't prove this, but I like to imagine that J.R. Tolkien's deep nerdery, his deep investment in these ancient languages, Old English, Old Germanic,
Mhm.
did connect him in some meaningful way to the spirit of those people. There's a I believe it's a Russian folk saying that if you learn a second language, you gain a second soul. I think that's maybe overstated slightly. Um, but there's a grain of something to that. Um,
Yes.
that motivates me to pick up another Greek word every, 3 weeks or so.
I like that saying a lot, and that's the first
Mm.
time hearing it, because it's very true. Because your own reality shifts when you start learning another language.
Hmm.
When you start to think in another language, you get to see different perspectives. Some languages are straightforward, some are not. Some
Yeah.
have very straightforward insults, some have really colorful ones.
Yes. Yes. Um, yes, very, very much so. I particularly enjoy and they have a sense if you want real mystery, if you want real I think the thing that's so offensive that struck out to me about the Oera Linda about not having the verisimilitude of authenticity was
Mhm.
it was so familiar in its tone. Whereas when you read Homer or when you read these old sagas, when you read Beowulf, there's this sense of distance. There's this sense of I am not in the same headspace as what this person is thinking. Like, why are they doing that? What's going on in their head that causes them to
Yes.
think and say these things? Why does Achilles, upon hearing Agamemnon say these things, want to draw his sword and kill him over this? Like,
Mhm.
but um, that is the invitation to initiation that so many of these people I think are looking for. Um, and unfortunately, I think a lot of what attracts people to these sort of modern occultic groups and circles and movements is they want to feel like they are deep in something without necessarily doing the work. Much like and this happens to me as much as it does to anyone else, listening to podcasts or certain audiobooks, you can get wrapped up in the feeling of learning something without actually holding on to any of it. And that
Yeah.
feeling, the feeling of learning can be addictive in its own way, whether you're learning anything or not. Um,
Yes, yes, it can. And I think a lot of times with the esoteric, it is a want for power in a way. And I
mm,
wouldn't even say power in the temporal sense. It is they want some type of spiritual power of
mm,
themselves because it creates a certain amount of guidance for people. It's a kind of like a guiding star, and that's why a lot of people want it. But in that vein, I would just say, really consider what you're looking at, and also, read actual texts, and you'll find the values through that.
yeah.
There is a healthy amount of distance in these sagas, and there's also the vagueness of history.
Yes.
You know, I think that's actually quite cool
The good
when you
stuff you have
read.
to work for.
Exactly. Like, I was reading Wulusbau in the Edda not that long ago, and they do have this term, aur.
Oh, you cut out at exactly the good word. Let's give him a minute to reconnect here. We've also been going on over a half hour. Oh, can you hear me now, Clinton?
uh,
There we
Vaguely.
are. Okay, I
Yeah.
can hear you now clearly. You were just in the middle of saying a cool word from Valuspa.
Oh, yeah, it was Arwar Alda. It was a term, it was basically in ages past, in time past.
Mm,
And it's interesting because at that point, it was ancient even then in the 12th and 13th century. And so even when they're recounting these poems, it was ancient, it was archaic. So it begs the question, how old are these things? Okay, and so
yeah.
that's something that I think we need to gauge. And people want those things. They want to be
Yeah.
connected with this past, and that's what I think ancient poems and ancient texts are really trying to convey. My advice would be to go directly to the poems, go directly to the language, interact with that, and learn as much as you can, and become acquainted with those stories and those values therein.
Yeah. To do the work, so to speak.
Exactly.
It's not in the gay Marxist sense, but in the fun, somewhat tedious but tremendously worthwhile philological sense. Um, yeah,
Yes.
and that what's funny is if you look at J.R. Tolkien and if you look at even at J.K. Rowling, who was I
Mhm.
believe had a master's in ancient French literature, like the real literary power comes from actually doing the work,
Yeah.
not faking it to try to project your desires into the past. Um,
Yes. And I think too, with that, if you don't know it, look for someone and learn it.
yeah,
Learn from them. That's the other thing where you can bridge that gap. A lot of times people didn't know many things, and so they could go to a specialist and learn from them. And that also creates a sense of community too, because a lot of
yeah.
people just simply want community,
And
and
you don't
that's
need to
actually taps into it.
agree with everything the specialist says, but even on the points of disagreement, that foundation still gives you orientation and puts you on the right track. And you say, okay, suppose I do want to disagree with this expertise. What's a legitimate disagreement and what's an illegitimate disagreement? I think one of the lamest disagreements
Yeah.
in the Robert Sepehr video was he said, some people say this is a forgery, but little do they know that forgery just means something that was copied. So when they say it's a forgery, that doesn't necessarily mean it's fake. And it's like that's like seventh grade logic, man. Like
I think my
it's
audio's cutting out again.
oh, okay. I'm sorry. I was just bashing on Robert Sepper a little bit. Um, so, um, well, we've been going for a little while. Clinton,
Yeah.
thanks so much for joining me. It is. I don't mean to just come on to bash the Oera Linda, but after a little bit of familiarity with some really good old texts and some of them thanks to you, it's so hard to watch people go for the fake stuff when There's so much good, real stuff out there to enjoy and to learn from and just spurn us to learn more for in a way.
Yeah, and we can look at these texts too, like even in criticizing them and learn more from them because it actually projects us forward.
Hmm.
It allows us to say, okay, we can negate this. What is the truth, and what are the truth of these things? So I would just say, use critical thinking.
Yes. Yes. That's a good way to end it. Clinton, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a really, really fun office hours. I hope Ian gets some value out of this. And anybody else interested in ancient texts, ancient history, ancient writings, and the sort of spirituality that we might derive from connection to those sources. Um, so thanks so much for listening and take care.